Welcome back to another edition of Unicorn Dispatch Live with your host, Bryson Boort, founder and CEO of SCYTHE. This one is a special Unicorn Dispatch Live. So usually we have our fireside with guests talking about different things. Today, not only do you get to meet my bosses, the board of SCYTHE, you also get the chance to hear all of their perspectives on what happened in 2025 and what to look forward in 2026. So why don't we start with introductions? Ron, if you could go first.
Hey there, Bryson. Good to see you. Ron Gula. I'm the president of Gula Tech Adventures. I got into investing after I was the CEO and co-founder of Tenable Network Security. Pleasure to be here.
Tansel.
Hey everybody, I'm Tansel. I'm a principal at Energy Impact Partners. We're a venture capital fund backed by large corporates, mostly electric utilities that are very interested in cybersecurity.
And Chris, calling all the way live from Singapore.
Absolutely, Bryson. Well, thank you for having me. And so Christopher Steed, Chief Investment Officer at Paladin Capital Group. We are a venture capital firm that is focused on critical infrastructure protection, particularly by way of identifying the increasing vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure by way of rapid digital adoption of that infrastructure. Been with the firm for 17 years, and it's a pleasure to be here, Bryson.
Well, thank you so much. All right, folks. So,
hey, Bryson, before you start, I mean, how many other investors go to Singapore for work and then come in and do a webinar for one of their own portfolios? So, I mean, Chris, that's just awesome, man.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Anything for Bryson.
Well, thank you. We appreciate the support all the way from across the world. Actually, what is the time zone difference from Singapore to the East Coast?
It's about 13 hours ahead of the East Coast in the U.S.
So it is like, what time is it where you are?
Well, it's always daytime. Always daytime for me here. It's 2 a.m. here, but always up, ready to go.
All right. So I want everyone at home to hear that, right? We've got Chris, who's the Chief Investment Officer, calling in 2 a.m. from Singapore to support this. So, Chris, with that, we're going to give you the luxury and the punishment of going first, which is, what was the biggest thing that you saw in 2025 that surprised you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that were very surprising in 2025, and it sort of leads to a lot of what we're continuing to see in 2026. You can't get away from the conversation about cyber without talking about the convergence of AI in cyber. And the level of adoption that we are seeing in customer environments, now really trying to operationalize it, and the acknowledgement that safety, security, and trust is something that is incredibly important, not just after the fact, but something that you need to instill at the very earliest stages for when you adopt a new technology, or when you create a new technology. And so the impact of AI, I think, inside of these customer environments, is one that the cybersecurity industry has been rapidly taking advantage of. It's a problem space that has been unaddressed for a very long time, despite the fact that AI and machine learning has been here for 50 to 60 years. It's only been 3 or 4 years since we've had that massive explosion of consciousness. And so you've seen in that market for AI security, a number of companies, even at those early stages, one, get adopted, get acquired, but two, receive massive amounts of funding. And so the chips are still in the air as we enter 2026 here, for where the market is going to continue to go. And so I think I was surprised in 2025 how rapidly the market shifted from trying to figure out what AI means for organizations to now having implemented it and then looking for safety, security, and trust in a very, very rapid way.
Tansel?
I mean, I agree with Chris. I think 2025 was really the year of AI. I think we saw it a lot across our portfolio companies as well. Either you are an AI native, or you're a SaaS company launching an AI product, and customers are asking for it, investors are asking for it, acquirers are asking for it. And so I think the most important thing right now, and the thing everybody is working on, is AI. And I think our challenge, as investors is, who should you back if you want to, do something in AI, right? Because most people haven't done it for for many years, right? And so is it somebody that has a good research background? Is somebody that's a fast learner? Is somebody that has a good team? But I think for us, it's very exciting as investors, and it gives us a new theme to chase. I think the same way kind of, everybody pushed from on-prem to cloud, everybody's going from cloud to AI. And so I think that's the really next big wave, and it's here to stay. The next 5-10 years, I think it's going to be all about AI. And really just at the beginning, every month I'm finding a different tool that's incredible. And so I can't imagine, a year ago, agents weren't even a thing, right? Now people are talking about agents, MCP servers. And that's also, really increasing the attack surface in the cyber world. And a lot of people are just scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. So I think for us as investors, it's an exciting time because there's just a lot of growth, a lot of new things emerging, and it's, we need to sharpen our pencil and stay on top.
I think both really, really good comments. I think 25, we kind of moved away from this concept that, are we adding AI to cyber products, or are we building cyber products for AI, and more about what's AI's impact on the business and the nation state struggle and that sort of stuff. So now, people are starting to ask questions like, if I automate everything with AI and I don't have a bunch of little Brysons, coming up behind me to train as CISOs, what's the future of cybersecurity? What's it going to look like? So we're starting to answer those questions or see those questions asked. I don't think we answered them in 25. And, but I think we're all grappling with that.
So certainly artificial intelligence is front of mind. We've started to see the beginning of the AI revolution, and there's a lot of questions on where that's going to go. And each of you talked about the market perspective. Certainly here at SCYTHE, artificial intelligence has been a large part of what we've been doing. We put a press release out in August talking about the work we've been doing with the Defense Department on innovative artificial intelligence application and offensive security. And we're going to be doubling down on that in 2026 ourselves. Something personally that I saw that I thought was a bit of a surprise to me is how long have all of you been hearing about quantum computing, right? Most of us have been hearing about it, right, on this cyclical kind of like quantum's going to come, quantum's going to come, quantum's going to come, and it's going to change the whole world. Well, I had somebody approach me in the middle of 26 and be like, hey, we need to start thinking about post-quantum cryptography now. And I was like, I've heard this story for my entire career, like many of us. And I went and started to dig into it. And it turns out to be a lot closer than we think. So my big surprise of 2026 was the fact that the post-quantum world is not a like continue mañana, but looks to be about 1 to 3 years out. And the other reality of this is we've seen adversaries already doing the exfiltrate encrypted things now to be able to decrypt later, which means you have a today problem, even if the technological innovation that's going to revolutionize that is still that 1 to 3 year mark out. And so companies need to be thinking about crypto agility now to be able to prepare for a post-quantum environment that's, again, the threat is already acting on today.
I think that's a good point. I think it's one of those, that's a hard one to convince the general public of, right? Because you can't touch it and you can't see it. But I do give this administration points for, moving forward with, hey, we're on a path to, swap out all the crypto with stuff that's going to be good. I also I've seen a bunch of startups. I don't think either any of us here has invested in these things, but there's companies out there that basically replace a VPN or point-to-point encryption with multi-hop and what I would say almost like stenography and stuff like that. So like if you're trying to collect on me now, it might look like I'm just surfing Facebook or something like that, even though I'm sending Gmail. So I'm encouraged by stuff like that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the quantum future is getting closer and closer. For the last 15, 20 years, we've talked about quantum computing being 1, 2, 3, 4 years away. We actually may be, where that is right now. And, I try to separate it into two buckets. There is that bucket of trying to enable a commercial grade quantum computer. There's still a lot of work to be done there. We're getting closer and closer to that. However, when you look at quantum-based methods applied against your current AI computing infrastructure, there are a lot of very interesting things that you can do. both in the cybersecurity realm as well as broader safety, security, and trust issues related to national security. And so I think it is very important that one, we start to draw out what does the quantum tech stack look like, or what can we envision that it will look like, and begin to take inventory of the cryptography that we currently already have in place. How do you protect those keys? How do you then look at agentic AI as a potential threat surface before you start to actually develop value off of that? And so I think there's a wave of companies that are coming that are not just focused on post-quantum cryptography, but applying quantum-based methods to existing computing infrastructure. And so as we look forward here, I don't think it's just going to be the largest organizations in the world that are maniacally concerned about protecting their trade secrets, personally identifiable information, and the list goes on. I think we will see a revolution for how we think about cryptography, especially in the age of these thinking, living, breathing machines, and as we get closer and closer to advanced robotics.
No, I agree.
Well, yeah, so I was about to say the robotics tie into Tansel and industrial control systems.
No, I think in my view, I think it might be a little bit further out from what I've seen. I think now we're just in the quantum space. We're maybe evolving out of the POC phase, proof of concept showing it's doable, to, like Chris said, finding ways to operationalize it. But I think it's still, maybe 5 to 10 years out, because I think there's still a lot that needs to be built out. And in my view, I think the next 5 years is probably just all going to be about supercomputers, which I think it's an intermediate step to getting to the quantum world.
Are there any other trends like that? So we've of course done the obligatory artificial intelligence, which continues to drive changes in ways that are going to accelerate past. It's just going to keep going. We talked about quantum, which has been another element. Is there anything else like that popped up in 2025 that folks might not be thinking about that were interesting in what you saw? Because each of you represent such a broad perspective of seeing all the latest cutting edge innovation and all these technologies that are changing the world.
Yeah. So just one thing is it's kind of a comment on the state of the cyber industry. I became an amateur animator a couple, 4 years ago. And I've seen this tremendous jump in technology on the animation side. Like if you haven't played with Sora, you're obviously living under a rock or something like that. But if you look at Sora, if you look at some of the videos I do, I'm doing these in my spare time. But from where it was 2-3 years ago, it's like Pixar level quality. Now, when I come into cyber though, and I say, where are the cyber AI? Like I look at this, I don't want to disclose the stuff you're doing at Scythe, but most of that stuff I would consider general, LLM adding into cyber. And there's some really cool automation there, but it's not a leapfrog. It's making the product maybe twice as better, maybe twice as easier to understand. It's not, a CISO in a box yet. It's not, an NSA pen tester in a box, right? So I feel like cyber is going to lag from the benefits of what's going on with all these other AIs out there. And there's probably a bunch of reasons for that. One is probably that we don't have enough data, believe it or not, I think, to train these models. And two, I don't think cyber rates as something that people want to spend a lot of time creating LLMs for. People can do it for video. You're going to make a lot of money doing that. You're going to do it for general stuff, but specialization in cyber, man, that's really tough. So I think there's a gap there.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of content creation, and advanced digital content creation, the exponential increase in the number of things, the number of images, the number of videos that continue to be out there that have been developed by these tool sets is really extraordinary. And so I do think we, especially in a world right now where the media industry is going through rapid and massive levels of consolidation and reshuffling. We need to think about how we create a level of authenticity around those types of things that we do create. How do we focus on embedding things like invisible and immutable digital watermarks for every single frame of a video that we create utilizing these tools. And I think this year, we are going to see a step up in the consumerization of AI. How does that apply to cyber? I think the jury is still out. There's many different ways that you can apply AI to better cybersecurity, or acknowledge that AI is being utilized by attackers to increase the efficacy of how they operate. And then also, again, looking at AI as a risk surface. You will increase your risk surface far before you actually get value out of these types of tools. And so I do think the impact of AI, is still something that we need to investigate. But then even going beyond that, again, focused on those types of new major waves of innovation that continue to come. It's going to be quantum, it's going to be advanced robotics. The space economy is still nascent relative to where it could go. And so I do think as we see these massive shifts and massive market shifts that continue to happen, at great speed and huge orders of magnitude, we do need to have our heads on a swivel, so to say. Because, as we look at, the threat landscape, it's evolving as fast, if not faster, than the types of defensive tools that have traditionally been in place.
No, I agree. I think another thing I've seen as well is maybe a resurgence of interest in privacy, because I think AI eats just a lot of data up. Social engineering is way up. We're even seeing some of our portfolio companies having their sales process slow down because now all of a sudden organizations are caring about, AI and privacy policies and processes you have in place. Because at the end of the day, if we think that models will get commoditized, the real differentiator would be around privacy. And so whether it's your personal data, your enterprise's data, I think in the long term, people realize it's going to be of a huge importance. Whereas before, it wasn't that big of an issue. It was mostly focused on kind of backup, I would say. But I think I've seen a resurgence across the board, whether it's enterprises, personal, for my personal use, or just employees as well.
So let's continue on the artificial intelligence conversation. A lot of what I've seen in AI, and of course, I think this is where we all sort of poke at it, is there's a lot of drive to just do AI. And the thing I always like to point out is AI is like any other automation, effectively, from a work use, a workflow, a productivity perspective, and it'll just get you there faster, right? Because we still have not reached a point where you can have 100% fidelity, integrity, and confidence in an AI output, particularly as it starts to get more sophisticated. And so the trust just on, I can do these things. I'll give an example. I had a founder come to me with an idea last year, and he basically spent the weekend vibe coding. And he was like, look at this thing that I built. Now, I'm not even going to get to the part of the fact that the market idea itself was directed to other founders. And I always pointed to myself as an example. We have no money. There's a reason I dress this way. So that is not a market you're going to make money on. But back to the technology is, if you just spent, basically, I don't know, roughly about 10 hours vibe coding something, what is the barrier to entry to anybody else in the world being able to do that as well? Some of the other challenges that I see is there's a lot of this conversation on AI there's a SaaS AI instance, pick your one, right? ChatGPT, Claude, et cetera. And I just make calls to it to doing something. All right. I mean, that can be kind of interesting, and you're going to be taking advantage of what it naturally gives you, but you're kind of just this sort of interface layer on top of it. And where I see the gap is, I think the real final frontier, the interesting innovations are going to be coming in. Where can I functionally train data for a specific application, right? Not just I'm making calls to things, but this is the refined data set to doing these things. And so the gap that I see is, one, having access to data doing that. And I see a lot of people chasing the AI development thing, but don't know anything about AI training. So what are some other challenges, or what you've seen with what I said on with artificial intelligence in the future?
I think some of the comments that have been made have been spot on, right? The privacy that Tansel was talking about, for example, if people just add AI to a cyber product, where is that AI running at, right? Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? Is it a private cloud? That's really important. And, when you think about, I'll pass to Chris and Tansel here for a second. Go ahead, guys.
No, I look at something like what happened with Anthropic, what was reported in September of 2025, in which hackers utilized its agentic capabilities, not just to plan attacks, but to actually execute attacks. And those are the types of things that, we do need to continue to be cognizant of as we move forward here. Is that threat actors are making as good, if not better, use of these technologies than those defensive tool sets. And most of the impact that we are seeing inside of our portfolio companies as well as elsewhere, you're able to get a new product to market and find product market fit much faster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the efficacy of your tool set is actually going to find things that ultimately lead to a level of resilience. And so I think the type of threat data that existing companies currently have are the crown jewels for a lot of these foundational models and the foundational companies that are coming out, with these great powerful models, but they're uninformed models. And so I also do think that the market is going to have to inevitably shift to more of an active inference methodology. Less data is required to train, and then actually modeling AI to think more like a human being, almost training AI as if it was a 2-year-old, then a 3-year-old, then a 4-year-old, to give it a level of cognition that we haven't seen in the past. And so it is going to be, I think, a constant tit for tat. As we see these attacks increase in sophistication and complexity, we have to think differently about how we go about defending them. And I also want to acknowledge that, I do think that at the end of the day, the human is going to remain in the loop. When it does come to AI, we have to think about it as a platform. We have to think about it as a tool. We have to think about it as something that can replicate processes, not replace humans. Let's enhance humans as we move forward.
No, I completely agree with Chris. I think the challenge I'm seeing too is around explainability and kind of guardrails, right? Why is the AI agent doing the thing that's doing? Us as consumers, we may not care if we get the same output every time, but if you're an enterprise, you don't want surprises, right? So I've even seen scenarios where the black box AI performs better than an AI solution with the human in the loop, but the enterprise ends up going with the human in the loop solution because they just don't want to hand over the keys to AI. So I think observability is going to become an even bigger thing. People are pushing more and more agents within your environment. So I think now we're experimenting, and as we start kind of deploying AI at scale, really understanding why AI is doing what it's doing, and having guardrails around it is going to become a huge area of focus for enterprises.
So I had two conflicting comments, and I guess I'm just going to frame them both, which is why I had a brain fart a second ago. So the first one is, look, we all get pitches from companies who have, AI coding in them. And look, these are viable companies with viable solutions, but I kind of put them on par with perhaps like integrators, network integrators. Like if you assemble Palo Alto and Cisco for a living, you're doing a valued service and you're providing something, but you shouldn't get the valuation of Palo Alto and Cisco. And the same way, if you're assembling code that Claude's flinging out, you're really not defending intellectual property there. You're doing that. So I kind of see that framing as one comment of these startups. And then the second one is, I think as investors, we've all had the moment where, we have 100x return, or it's just this amazing one company, like, oh, I only want to do these companies like this again. And every investor goes through this. And I'm seeing investors kind of lament, like, wow, with this AI stuff, I can only invest in maybe one or two founders, and they're just going to code everything else with AI. And I'm like, oh, you mean all those techie founders who aren't good with people that you've been passing on for the past 30 years? Now you want to invest in those people because of AI? And they usually walk away and go, yeah, that's right. There's other reasons those guys didn't work either. Ladies didn't work in the past. So yeah.
There's also been a discussion on the fact that we are going to be running out of all the data to train this stuff, right? I mean, at the end of the day, humanity has only created so much knowledge that's accessible. And there's also been the conflict on the legal side with these companies using basically whatever they can get, right? The internet's free. If I can scrape it, I get to use it. And, now 4chan and Reddit has a lot of value where it was more of edgelord space before. Do you see any different approaches to that challenge or innovation there?
Yeah, I mean that's called the recursion problem, right? Where you ingest bad stuff and you retrain and whatnot. So, we've been getting pitched a bunch of newer type of, I'll just call them transforms, not necessarily LLMs, where you give it a ground source of truth. You give it the employee manual, you give it the source code, you give it whatever, and then you could ask questions about that. And in my mind, you kind of go back to the late 90s where you had all these, knowledge management systems, these knowledge graphs and that sort of things. But you put a chat GPT interface kind of on it and you trick people into, asking something like that. You actually can get some decent performance that doesn't have to run on GPUs and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I do think, one of the concepts that we're going to start to see more and more of are secure data lakes. How do you apply things like homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation, confidential computing to be able to access proprietary data in an anonymous way, to be able to utilize that data in order to strengthen these models. And something that was announced out of the current administration, Mission Genesis. How do we bring all of these data silos across academia, research labs inside of the U.S. government together, so that we can, one, create a level of data governance over that data, and then two, expose that data to those that need it that are on mission, and then also bring in the private sector to be able to access it for those types of mission critical solutions. And so as we look forward here, I think there's one of two paths, and we're going to go down both. It's these active inference methods that require less data and more cognition that is built into these models, and then a unifying of these data silos so that for those tools that absolutely need it, they can access it and do so in a very secure way.
I also think, maybe the next frontier, it's capturing data in our physical world, because a lot of it has just been kind of, whatever's on the internet or whatever you can access on a desktop. But I think as we start having more sensors out there, we do more robotics, more autonomy, I think the amount of data that's going to be generated from, trying to capture data in the physical world is going to be orders of magnitude bigger than what we have now. And so that's probably another big opportunity I see down the road.
So I think that's interesting, kind of tying Tansel and Chris, what you've said together is you were talking about collecting data from the physical world. And at the same time, both of you have mentioned advanced robotics. And if you think about it, advanced robotics are the ability to have an artificial intelligence implementation that is able to physically interact with the world, which, Tansel, back to our specialty with energy impact partners and industrial control systems, is effectively what industrial control systems, also known as cyber physical systems, are. It's the one of the definitions I give is there's between ICS and a computer is data and information processing, whereas industrial control systems are something that literally changes the physical world. It's not a spreadsheet about it. It's not a PowerPoint about it. It does it.
No, I agree. And I think the security implications are going to be 10 times higher, right? If you can have something that can physically interact with you, you better make sure you put something good out there, right? Because you don't know what the repercussions are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And aligned against business initiatives, let's just say that you're an organization that is trying to manufacture and sell to the consumer a self-driving car. However, if that consumer cannot 100% verify that that car is going to stop at a stoplight when it sees a stoplight, they are probably not going to buy. So when you look at it from that perspective, you put all of these R&D dollars, all of these production dollars to develop that vehicle. But if they don't buy it because they simply can't trust it, the ROI from that goes to zero. And if you are a nation like the United States that is highly dependent on innovation for GDP growth, that lack of adoption and that ultimate lack of trust will hit the bottom line from a GDP growth standpoint.
So I'm gonna, before I change topics, anything else on artificial intelligence that we haven't covered yet?
We're doomed.
We're doomed. The singularity is upon us.
Yep.
This is the reason you need to say please to ChatGPT is you need to grovel now.
It will remember. If you try to prevent it from coming into existence, it will remember, and it may just take revenge.
Don't piss off your smart refrigerator, I think is the final takeaway from that one. Pivoting to more core. So back in about 2022, 2023, Gartner came out with a new framework on how companies should be approaching the overall cycle of risk management called continuous threat and exposure management, which is listed here in the question. And what this has done is it has taken all of the Gartner quadrants and basically put them into a cycle from the enterprise perspective of how they would approach risk management, which includes, scope, discovery, execution of that kind of validation and testing. That's where SCYTHE fits into it, and the adversarial exposure validation. I do want to take credit because I literally created the phrase adversarial on purpose as an adverb back in 2018 because I was trying to create a market distinguishing word choice. So I don't know, Ron and Chris, if you remember back in that time, and we were debating back with Dmitry Alperovich, who's the co-founder of CrowdStrike in those days, and we were, and he's the one who coined in our board meeting the continuous automated red teaming, CART, which I've now seen some other folks start to bring back. And so it's funny to see the things that we all brainstormed 8 years ago now being common lexicon for different reasons. But back to the continuous threat exposure management, the idea was this is more the enterprise perspective of bringing all of these different disparate market segments and vendors into what can now be a holistic approach to risk management. So what have you been seeing there?
Look, I'm happy that the market, at least the market analysts, are catching up with kind of what you're inventing and putting down. It's one of the big reasons I think we all invested. And look, I mean, coming from Tenable, you can count all the systems, count all the vulnerabilities, and then correlate them with attacks, correlate them with threats, correlate them with TTPs, and that's fine. But that's a lot different than what you're doing with SCYTHE of actually putting, bits on the ground, so to speak, and measuring what controls work and don't work. So I'm quite happy that this got as much press as it did over the last couple of years, sort of like the fine point on top of like maybe what MITRE ATT&CK started a long time ago. So I'm pretty happy to see where it's at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember the Lockheed kill chain model, and working our way back from that, it was always okay if we can catch it at those first, couple of steps, maybe we can infer what's going to happen next. Now we can prove what's going to happen next. And as we take our step forward into a more AI-driven model and mindset, we're going to be able to do that and much faster, and certainly with much higher levels of efficacy. And so, I do credit Bryson, looking forward and continuing to skate ahead of the puck. The puck is finally catching up with you, Bryson, and so I'm really encouraged by where the market is going and the acknowledgement that you do need these types of tools in place to just simply better understand what is my risk posture as an organization, much less, what is my risk posture related to all of these cybersecurity products that I have currently in place.
I agree. I think what it's addressing at its core too is just the data overload problem. Like we have all these findings, all this data. And so how are we more efficient of, defending our business? What do we prioritize? What is actually exploitable? And it's just kind of putting context around all that data. And I think where all that data was siloed in a bunch of different tools, a few years ago, Gartner's pushing everything to be unified right now, and you guys are a key piece of that.
Yeah, Chris, you and I've been talking about that. This is and I've discussed it on some other webinars in the past, but one of the challenges of being a founder is there's kind of three components of success that I've seen, right? One is you're looking at the founder and the team. You're looking at the timing, and timing is that kind of luck part. And so, I mean, back when SCYTHE was first created, when Target approached us in 2016, the advantage of having a real world customer use case, which is one of the challenges that you have with doing these things, is it's not just you create an idea and then you go try to find if there's a market. So we got to start with that. And while I co-developed it with them for 2 years, we went out and tried to establish the market, ultimately leading into Ron with Gula Tech Adventures, anchoring us for the seed round, Paladin Capital following, and then Tansel with Energy Impact Partners joined us on the A round when we raised several years later. And it was really interesting to learn the timing problem in person. because what we had built was a solution for a market that didn't effectively exist at that time. And so where Chris is making that comment that the puck has started to come to us, that is a reflection of what we've seen in the team, tied back to the continuous threat exposure management question of how a lot of the competition was able to succeed just because they had a pretty dashboard, not because they provided cybersecurity. And it took time for the market to realize the penalty of that kind of approach. So Chris, I don't know if you want to share any more of your insights on those conversations that you and I have had time back into this, because I think it's interesting for anybody and just seeing how innovation really works in the space from that founding and investment perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And given your background, given your history, Bryson, understanding, how to operate with legal authority to discover vulnerabilities, to exploit systems, and actually retrain those systems to do those things that they were not originally intended to do. I remember some of our earliest conversations when we met in 2013, and I've told you this before, you were one of the first, true cyber operators, that I deeply interacted with. They got a better understanding of, what it means, to perform reconnaissance, to then, go back and iteratively better understand, how do we get inside of the four walls? Then once we're inside of the four walls, how do we stay quiet? How do we gather the data that we need? And then once we get that, we wait for the right time in order to execute something to be able to exploit it. And so as I look at, the evolution of the space, when we made the investment in SCYTHE, it seemed very logical, that the market would be there right then and there. However, it's taken time, and I think, organizations, continue to, and in particular, chief information security officers, they've been pulling their hair out. They see 300, 400, 500 new shiny objects by way of cybersecurity companies that have been created every single year. And the vast majority of those solutions, they all sort of say the same thing. We stop 99.99% of your problem. Well, if that was true and all of those solutions were getting adopted, the problem wouldn't be getting worse, but it continues to get exponentially worse. And so we have to rethink it from that attacker mindset. What would an attacker do? How would a Bryson operate in your environment with the legal authority to do so? And if you look at it from that perspective, you start to get to a more logical conclusion of, well, if we're going to go tit for tat, let's take that attacker mindset and start to deploy it in a more defensive way. And especially in the geopolitical environment that currently surrounds us, where regulation around the world is becoming more and more difficult to navigate, and the internet is becoming more and more fragmented. And so as you look at it from that perspective, you simply have to be more informed as to what is the state of the art from an attacker mindset, and then back into, how you defend yourself with the knowledge for where your vulnerabilities are. At the end of the day, you may want to have an open port that would naturally be something that a security tool would cover, but from a business logic standpoint, a configuration management standpoint, you do want to keep that port open, and so if you're going to keep it open, you better still have your eyes on it, and so I think there's just a huge market opportunity here for where SCYTHE, and I think where, others that are having or that are taking this mindset, where they're going to be able to continue to execute and where they're going to continue to find market share.
Ron, I'm gonna go back to you on that one as the first one to believe in me and believe in us and believe in the idea. What was your thinking and how have you seen that evolve?
Well, the analogy I like to use is IT people, cyber people don't really treat data and networks the same way maybe a pilot and an airline designer treats an airplane. And, this stuff's really important. So I've always looked at SCYTHE as like a second way of telling me if I'm secure. I might have a Tenable. I might be able to crunch my vulnerabilities, my assets, come up with a really good score. But you know what? Like I said, I want some bits on the ground and seeing what's going on. And even on Chris's comments about, all these rapid new companies that are coming, I think there's even more potential risk in these platforms that are out there. CrowdStrike just bought a couple companies. We had Palo buy a bunch of companies. Checkpoint bought a bunch of Zscaler buying companies. So if you're just assuming that they're going to integrate and work well, you still need this independent way of making sure that all your controls are in place and working, and not just blindly trusting whatever platform you bought into is getting the job done.
And then Tansel Energy Impact Partners, as I noted, came in later, and you represent, I think, a really interesting perspective on the market, because Energy Impact Partners is effectively a fund of strategics, right? It is funded by the critical infrastructure asset owners who are running our power, our water, and all of those things that underpin modern society. And so how does that side of the market and Energy Impact Partners and your perspective on this?
Yeah, so we came in a little bit later, and I would say when you had a little bit more of a product market fit. So the way we heard about you guys is one of our utility partners, he told us, I don't know if these guys are raising, but I really like the tech and I'm going to become a customer of theirs. And, that's how I got engaged with Bryson. And so we really come, we take the stage we come in, it's around more Series A and B, so it's less product risk. You have some product, of course, going to get better over time. But what really on the right is kind of go-to-market risk and the size of the market opportunity. And having some of our utility LPs adopting the solution kind of really give us conviction that, this is a product category that people care about. They're spending real dollars. And I think what really also differentiates SCYTHE is, a lot of companies out there, they're mostly focused on IT, and I think there's some unique use cases for SCYTHE to expand in OT, which is, rapidly digitizing. There's a big opportunity there as well. And so we got pretty excited from the get-go, and that's kind of how we got conviction in the opportunity. And I would just say also now, with AI, you're seeing attackers moving at machine speed, so to say. And so having things, on the defensive side that can kind of replicate that, rather than just a basic pen test where it's mostly services, people see even more value in something like that. And the competitors out there, a lot of them, it's more of a black box solution. And so there's always some, hesitance in deploying those fully within your enterprise, because you really don't know if it may trip something or what it's actually doing.
So what are your expectations? Like I talked about, it seems like the puck has started to catch up. Enterprises now rank cybersecurity risk, typically publicly listed ones, ranking in their top 5. Usually it averages about 3 or 4 in the overall risks to an organization. And I always like to highlight that to our audience, because we tend to have more of the IT cybersecurity practitioners, and realizing that you are never going to be the number one risk, right? At the end of the day, the core operating risk of a business, cybersecurity, is going to be anywhere from 3 to 5. But they're waking up to, again, how can we do it better? Because we no longer have a choice not to do it. The particular incident that kills me over and over again is Jaguar Land Rover, who had a ransomware attack, I think about 5 months ago. They're still offline. And when you think about that, there's a cascading impact if you have the manufacturer, but think about all of that supply chain and all of those mom and pop shops that are feeding into that core manufacturer, who, when production stops, the whole supply chain stops. And most likely for many of those smaller vendors, that was the major customer that they had. Furthermore, Jaguar Land Rover is so large that it represented potentially a 0.1 to 0.3% hit to the overall GDP economy of the United Kingdom. So, right, everyone rolls their eyes when the Ponemon Institute report comes out, and it's like, a breach costs $11 million. And everyone's like, okay, whatever. But particularly in industrial control systems, where safety and availability equals revenue, there's no question on that immediate impact. And in information technology environments, I think everyone's waking up to, the portfolio can no longer be, like Ron noted earlier, buy that and put it in and you're good to go. We need ways to evaluate the technology. But again, cybersecurity isn't just the technology, it's the people side. And if you're not including what everybody first understands as the users, but also the cybersecurity staff, which is the key part of your detection and response, and detection and response is most of your cybersecurity posture, where's this going? How do enterprises start to get ahead of this? How do these practitioners need to start recognizing those challenges now?
So, go ahead, Chris. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for a very long time, organizations have seen cybersecurity as a cost center, and it's a liability shield. And for most, it's a thorn in the side. Now, we are seeing organizations move to a posture that cybersecurity is a competitive advantage. Something that you have operationalized into your normal business processes is not just good for that organization, but it also, for companies that are trying to sell into those organizations, they're no longer just selling to the chief information security officer. They're able to move horizontally to be able to better defend things like your business process optimization initiatives, to better defend your application development lifecycle, to better defend your reputation in the market against things like misinformation and disinformation. These are tools that create a competitive advantage, and going back to the example of being an organization that is trying to develop a self-driving car, one that is building trust, safety, and security into it from the ground up is going to be the one that wins relative to those that simply overlook it, as simply a cost center, a liability shield. Well, this is something I have to do. Well, no, this is something that you must do. And now in the regulatory environment that we see developing around the world, you're absolutely mandated to do this. And so why not? Look at it from the business context standpoint. You're developing organizations, you're growing organizations, you want to remain up and running 100% of the time. And regardless of whether it's a cyber attack or a misconfiguration of software and systems and networks, you just simply want to remain up and running. And so cybersecurity is an ROI driver, a defender of your revenue, a defender of what you're spending money on, both in terms of people and technology.
I think there's two ways to kind of look at this as well. So one, for small business, we're seeing a rise in these click to comply type offerings, and we can roll our eyes or debate as compliance security, but it's at least, if you're having a problem maintaining compliance, you're probably a very easy target for ransomware. So anything that makes that easier, I'm really happy about. Well, the thing I like about SCYTHE in the large enterprise, though, is that for those, most large enterprises have some sort of religion when it comes to risk management, cybersecurity, and whatnot. SCYTHE really allows them to have a real conversation about the effectiveness of their cybersecurity program and the efficiency. In other words, can I do the same protection and spend less money? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I can switch to open source. Maybe there's this outsource thing. Unless you've got SCYTHE, doing the actual measurement of the controls, how do you measure apples and bananas, right? Or apples and oranges there. So I think it really allows enterprises to optimize how they want to roll and avoid being the next, big ransomware headline.
No, I agree. And I think just going back to your story also, Bryson, I think hackers, right, they're in the business of making money and they're going to hit where it hurts the most, right? And so I think historically, they were just going a lot about just encrypting data. People got smart to that. They're backing it up. Then they start doing data exfiltration. But I think what we're seeing really right now is them going after the physical world because the cost of breaches there are the highest, right? You take down a plant, you're talking, if it's a big organization, maybe a few $1 million an hour, right? And so the willingness in those environments to pay is much higher. And because just the impact on us is higher as well. So I think you're going to see more and more. If anything, I think you're going to see larger breaches of this magnitude just because it's more profitable for the attackers.
All right, this is going to be the last question of the audience. I'm going to bring it back to our lightning round closeout. So, of course, artificial intelligence continues to be top of mind, but I like this one because it approaches it from a different angle. So as artificial intelligence regulation shifts from uncertainty to enforcement, and we see a lot of this in the federal and the states trying to create laws, frameworks. NIST has put out an excellent document, NIST AI-100-1, which I consider the easy gold standard for folks that are looking at policy and governance. So how are you underwriting regulatory exposure today? And are you viewing compliance and governance as constraints on growth or sources of defensibility, which I think is a great market question?
So when I look at this question, I jump to one of my talking points, which is if you're in cyber and you're in charge of cyber, you shouldn't be talking about how to secure AI. You should be in charge of AI. And if you're not in charge of AI, you will get replaced by AI. So, cybersecurity people have got all the history of making ethical decisions about Should this process be done by a human, or can we use automation, right? They've been looking at the EULAs. They've been looking at all the different, issues with third-party risk and, all of these things that come into to governance. But the point here is, if we don't lead on how to do AI, we'll get replaced by AI. Can I go? Ooh, right?
No, I think it's a really valid point. And, look, you look at something like the EU AI Act, it's an incredibly draconian piece of legislature, and so as you look at something like that, for us, we are globally focused. About 70% of the capital we put to work is in the US, 30% is in that international environment. It is getting harder and harder to be able to sell US technology into the EU. And so as we're going through our due diligence process, we are mapping against what that regulation has put into place. And I do think, part of the fundamental problem here, not to pull it away from AI, you've got over 90% of US public companies having cybersecurity as part of a board level conversation and a key component for how they are thinking about defending those business processes. Yet less than 10% of those individuals that actually sit on those boards have any sort of background in things like cybersecurity, AI, and technology. We've got to bring the policymakers closer to the innovators. We can't make laws in a vacuum, that ultimately inhibit the ability for this technology to really achieve its end goals.
And from my view too, I would say maybe in the last year, it wasn't really a challenge. Like people were adopting AI, but I think enterprises are waking up to it. There's a ton of unsanctioned, unapproved use of AI, or even if it's approved, you're using your personal account on it. And so I think it went from an afterthought to a main area of focus, because people are just realizing the benefits are so high, it's sprawling so rapidly within the organization, and they realize they really don't have a handle on it. And going back to Chris's point about being a board level conversation, we've heard from some of our CISOs directly, where maybe 2-3 years ago, this is for utilities, they were talking about, how are we securing our OT environment with all this digital transformation? Now we need to use AI, how are we securing it? And so it's really a top of mind conversation for a lot of CISOs out there.
And on Tansel's note there about the board, the next Unicorn Dispatch Live is going to be on 26 January with Alex Sharp, and we're going to be talking about the board perspective with him having advised other boards, because I'm not going to cheat with my own board on answering that. All right, so for the final question, and this is something, again, I think all of you are of the investment base as well, uniquely qualified for, because I think a lot of, again, most venture capital is West Coast focused, and this is not going to be a surprise, but Silicon Valley is fascinated with itself. And it turns out that technology is existing in a world of everything that's happening. We have geopolitics, we have national security, we have these macro events, we have macroeconomics that is shifting and changing all of these things, and cybersecurity and technology, some influence that and some change in response to that. So what kinds of macro events are you worried about? What kinds of societal changes you think are going to continue shape and drive this landscape when we look at the continuing changes that happen in fraud and crime, the long-running discussions we have on mis and disinformation, the fact that we continue to all look for when's there going to be the next Stuxnet, or when is cybersecurity truly going to be an integrated part of the kinetic battlefield, right? That's the whole spectrum of what's going to be driving all of this stuff. So what do you see around the corner? And I'll start with you, Ron.
So have you seen the movie Idiocracy? Right? If you haven't seen that, it's basically says, only people with less intelligence have more people, so therefore people get dumber a long time. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think AI is going to make our future generations, I don't know if it's going to make them superhuman. Like maybe it might make them lazy. Maybe it might have the effect of freezing development. Even though we've had all these breakthroughs, I think we might get to a point where it might just stop advancing. And so I'm a bit worried about that. I don't know how much of the human spirit, the human intelligence you can make with an LLM and these new types of technologies. That's my biggest concern. What are we losing along the way?
Yeah. My biggest concern, is right along those lines, Ron. how do we better evaluate the psychological impact of the human-machine interaction? We were not built, to operate at AI speed. However, when it comes to cognition, we beat AI every single time. When does emotion start to come into play? Those are the types of things that, I think we're going to see more and more of. And those are the types of waves that I think we need to get ahead of. We want to continue to see this advancement, and as people get more and more concerned, of their, own mental state, their psychological state, by way of all of these rapid shifts of technology and these major market shifts in the capital markets, every single day, the speed and the magnitude of these things, are continuing to come down the pipe here. And so, I do think we need to be very cognizant of that psychological impact on human beings themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Human psychology and interactions, maybe they have some questions where I would go to my dad or my friend or somebody I knew from work. But now if I can just do it with AI, what does that do to our interactions and how we behave as societies, right? And especially for the younger generations, because I think our generations, we've seen both. We raised the old school way, but now this AI came. But there's going to be a whole new generation of people that are just, born in the AI native world.
So something that I saw that I think is going to be a driving macro trend is we've been talking about the balkanization of the internet for about a decade, right? It started with the Great Firewall in China that was starting to cordon them off. We all know North Korea has its own internet for, its 4 websites and 7 computers. Russia has started to do the same kind of thing. We just, with the Iranian Revolution, have witnessed the government being able to shut off the entire internet. And also a unique moment that I haven't seen before is the deployment of jammers to also affect Starlink, which was meant to be the alternate path out for that kind of communication. And so where I've seen that increase even further beyond the balkanization at the DNS, the internet level, is I've started to see an extreme interest in that kind of balkanization in creating their own technological ecosystem. I believe it was just Germany in the last week announced that they want to move off of Microsoft. You have an example where China has been trying to move off and creating its own OS in that same kind of way. And something that I saw in my trips to the Middle East last year is they have a local interest in driving and creating their own sovereign, and that's what the way they look at it is, it's a sovereign technical ecosystem that is independent from what they consider Western or American influence, because we've traditionally been the innovative engine for all of this technology, the primary innovation engine for all of this technology. So I want to say, first, I got to give an award out to Chris Steed. Every conference always recognizes who came the furthest. Chris, calling in at now almost 3 a.m. from Singapore, wins the award. And I'm going to probably just give it, you're going to win the award for the entire year. I can't see anyone else willing to take that award from you. So first of all, congrats and thank you. All of you, your time is incredibly valuable, as are your insights. So thank you for joining me on this today and sharing all of this with the audience. Reminders to the audience, offensive security, don't do anything without a get out of jail free card. So whatever it is, make sure that you're not going to jail with getting caught. You have the right piece of paper for it. And look forward to seeing you all at the next Unicorn Dispatch Live, where we're going to talk explicitly the board perspective on the 26th. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bryson.